This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. If you like to gamble, there's plenty of places to try your luck. From the old-fashioned lottery to Keno in local bars and restaurants. You can also travel to the 2 big casinos in southeastern Connecticut to play slots or lay down a wager. And there's action happening at the state capitol, too, as lobbyists for a bill to legalize sports betting in the state place bets that this session they can make it happen. While government and private companies gain billions through gaming, it's at the expense of people. People like your family members, your coworkers, your neighbors. Of course, not everyone becomes addicted to gambling, but it happens to people from all different backgrounds. Today, Where We Live, we look at a new report from Connecticut Public Radio and Sharing America. It's an initiative that covers race, identity, and culture in 4 cities, including Hartford. In the series Fixed Odds, Sharing America looks at the issue of problem gambling on communities of color. And Connecticut Public Radio reporter Vanessa Della Torre is part of that collaboration. And she joins me in studio to talk about her story in this series. Vanessa, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Lucy.
So we were wondering, where did this idea come from to look at problem gambling on communities of color?
It actually started with one of our guests here, Quinn Trong. As a journalist, sometimes you're like, what's going to be my next big story? So I was talking to Quinn, who's a healthcare advocate, about issues of mental health in communities of color. And during that conversation a few months ago, she mentioned the significant cultural stigma in Asian cultures over mental health and addiction issues, including gambling addiction. She was talking about the issue of gambling addiction in her community. And to me, that was something that was new. Quinn was just kind of mentioning, like, this is reality, this is fact of life. But to me, I was like, let me learn more about this. And so in the course of reporting and research, we found that there's a consensus among researchers who study this issue that there are elevated rates of gambling addiction among communities of color, including Asians, including African Americans, including Latinos, and there are other populations that are also vulnerable, including military veterans.
Now, in your report, and we're going to tweet out the link, it's also on our website at wnpr.org/wherewelive, you were looking at problem gambling affecting Southeast Asian refugees. What makes that population so vulnerable, Vanessa?
There are numerous reasons. So we have, Southeast Asian refugees here in Connecticut. There are neighbors. There are residents. And there are a number of factors. One is that in certain Asian cultures, there's a big emphasis on fortune and luck. And so gambling is seen as already very socially acceptable. It's part of the entertainment. It's, a way that families bond. Pretty much any type of family gathering, whether it's like a baby shower or birthday, holidays, you can expect, the family to be gambling in some way. And that includes games of cards or dice, but this is an activity that involves kind of the whole family. So that was one of the reasons. But another major reason is that there's a significant history of trauma for Southeast Asian refugees who came to the U.S. after the Vietnam War. So what we found is that the high of gambling becomes a way of seeking comfort. One of the folks I talked to is an expert named Dr. Timothy Fong. He's an addiction psychiatrist at UCLA's Gambling Studies program. He talked a lot about that, this history of trauma. Another factor is that a lot of refugees end up in low-wage work, so there is an issue of poverty. And so among some refugees, gambling is seen as a way of making fast money. So another reason, there are so many reasons, is that there is easy access in Connecticut to gambling. There are certainly like illegal card games, but there's also easy access to casinos.
You mentioned the role of, playing cards and gambling within Asian communities, families. And so I wanted to bring in Quinn Trong, who you mentioned. She's Outreach and Evaluation Manager of the North Central Regional Mental Health Board. Quinn, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Lucy.
So let's hear a little bit about your personal story. Where did your family come from? And talk about a little, build on what Vanessa was saying about how gambling plays a part in your culture.
Sure. My family came from Vietnam. We are refugees, and my family, we have an extended family, but my personal family came in late 1990. And when we came to the United States, my aunts and uncles and grandmother all lived within, a 10-mile radius of each other. And so often on the weekends, we would get together to talk and to cook and to eat and also to play cards. I mean, this was a huge part of my upbringing, to be surrounded by family and to play games as part of reconnecting with our culture and remembering what Vietnam is about and using the language and bringing that tradition onto the next generation. So gambling for us was, it brings a cozy feeling to me to see a deck of cards because it reminds me of my grandmother and the traditions that she tried to pass on. And so, having it be a central part of our lives, we are exposed to it from a young age. We like it, we appreciate it, but because of that, it can also vulnerabilize our community to the problems of gambling, like Vanessa mentioned.
When we think about specific Asian cultures, the role of fortune and luck, can you talk a little bit more about that? Not just that feeling of, when you're with your family, that togetherness, but how in specific cultures, thinking about luck and fortune and how it's not something that people, not all cultures embrace, but in specific cultures there is that feeling and acceptance. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Quinn?
Sure. I mean, I know that within our culture, we think that, certain numbers have imbued within them a lucky significance, or certain dates are lucky. And so for us, having an opportunity or a chance, it coincides with certain numbers. And so for us, gambling is a chance to kind of use that knowledge of certain numbers and certain dates to better our fortunes. And so it feels more controllable than it actually is. And we always hope that luck is going to come our way, which is why we engage in recreational card playing or gambling in a big way.
When I was reading Vanessa's story, I was thinking back to my parents are from India, and numbers and astrology playing a big part in Indian culture. But also I remember my dad religiously would play the lottery. I remember him sitting at the table and coming up with specific numbers to play. And, he never won, but I always wondered, as I was an adult, what was it about playing the lottery that he enjoyed so much? Vanessa, I wanted to go back to you as we talked to Vanessa de la Torre, who's a reporter for Connecticut Public Radio, also part of a public radio collaboration called Sharing America. There's a new series this collaborative put out called Fixed Odds, and it looked at problem gambling among communities of color. Vanessa, you focused in on Southeast Asian refugees. What do we know about that population in Connecticut? What are their financial realities?
Well, Quinn might be able to speak more to this, but I mean, the fact is that some come in, not necessarily knowing English right away. So unfortunately, that only opens up certain jobs, including factory jobs, low-wage jobs. And so the reality is that there is a lot of poverty in this community in Connecticut.
Quinn, did you want to add to that in terms of the types of jobs and what their circumstances are financially?
Absolutely. I mean, certainly the older generation face a lot of barriers to employment when they first come here. Certainly my parents, who were educated in Vietnam, had no English opportunities or abilities. And while I learned English in school and had peers, they really struggled to learn it in their 30s and 40s. And so they worked at the grocery store. They were, my dad was a machinist. He worked at the hotel and did dishes. And so it's a lot of, blue collar, low wage jobs that you have access to. And then in addition, you're kind of isolated if you're part of the older generation. You're kind of ensconced in your cultural communities because you don't have a lot of opportunities to go out and socialize and meet other people outside of your community or family.
And seeing how vulnerable that makes them, especially when they're on, working minimum wage jobs and they're on fixed incomes, so to speak, but then, spending some of that money on gambling and not being able to stop because of that addiction.
Yeah, it's a big concern for us, and especially for the older generation that is less likely to want to talk about it because it's such a stigmatized issue. Much more likely to talk about their wins or the excitement of gambling or the cultural aspects of gambling, but much less likely to seek help for it.
Vanessa spoke again to Dr. Timothy Fong. He's a professor of addiction psychiatry and co-director of UCLA's Gambling Studies program. This is what he said when she asked specifically about the Southeast Asian refugee population.
And when you have tremendous amounts of poverty, particularly in the Southeast Asian refugee population, that tends to be a very tempting idea.
So we heard Quinn talk about that, where people are still gambling, thinking that maybe luck will bring them out of their circumstances. This is where we live. Again, Quinn Trong in studio with me, Outreach and Evaluation Manager of the North Central Regional Mental Health Board, and Vanessa Della Torre, reporter for WNPR, Connecticut Public Radio. If you have a question or you have a comment about problem gambling in our communities here in the state, you can join us, 860-275-7266. When we think about the Southeast Asian refugee community, what studies have been done looking at these specific populations, whether they're Cambodian, Vietnamese?
Right. So there's one particular study that was done more than a decade ago. The report came out in 2003, and a lot of experts, because there's not a whole lot of literature and data on this area, they point to this particular study that came out in 2003. It was led by the late Nancy Petrie out of UConn Health Center, and it took a look at 96 Southeast Asian refugees from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam who were in Connecticut and attending, Southeast Asian community centers. And so did a survey on them, and it found that nearly 60% of them were addicted to gambling, which was astronomical. I mean, that's nearly 30 times the national average.
In your story, wagering at least $500 in the past 2 months, and the games that they played, the things that they were looking at were lottery and cars, the slot machines and scratch tickets. We know how easy it is to pick those up at convenience stores.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so sometimes people don't associate scratch-offs with gambling necessarily. It's like, oh, I'm just going to get some scratch-offs, or I'm going to play the lottery. I mean, those are forms of gambling. In addition to the card games, the dice, and going to the casinos with the slot machines and the card games.
Quinn, if it's such a problem, why has this issue remained hidden for so long?
Well, we don't like to talk about it as a community. As I mentioned before, it's difficult for Asian Americans to talk about mental health in particular, and problem gambling is a subset of mental health, right? It's an addiction, and people often don't want to share the bad luck or bring a bad name upon their family. And so they're reluctant to talk about it until it's too late. And then suddenly, they can't pay their mortgage, or debtors are coming after them. And that's how the community finds out. I mean, through these very extreme crisis moments is when we finally figure out the problem. But, one of my big passions is to get the word out, to talk about gambling and problem gambling and mental health issues, so that it's not so stigmatized, and so that we can address it sooner rather than later, rather than at the crisis point.
That study that Vanessa mentioned, done in 2003, is there a push to try to encourage researchers to look at this problem again among this population?
I mean, certainly there are community advocates who are very interested in getting this kind of research and in also gathering data and disaggregating that data so that we can figure out the issues particular to certain minority communities within Connecticut. That's a really tough issue for us to be tackling at this point, but it's something that, I'm certainly very passionate about, and I'm going to be talking with the legislature about this season. We're also working on trying to push for community health workers, people who are from within the communities, who can speak to these community issues, who can connect community members to services or resources or translation services so that they can get the help that they need. And that's another issue that we're very passionate about.
We started the hour talking about your personal experience and, again, your memories of your family playing together. How did your parents talk to you about gambling or this issue of addiction? Because you mentioned among Asians, we don't talk about getting help if there's a problem.
Right, absolutely. I mean, my parents encouraged us to participate in the games, when we were with my grandmother. It's a huge family endeavor. And so they encouraged it. But my dad, who survived a war and who, was imprisoned for his role in the war as a South Vietnamese soldier, warned us against the dangers of gambling. And so he wanted to make sure that while we engaged in it as a family, that, it didn't go beyond that there were repercussions beyond which we could control. And we were so cash strapped as a family, we needed to focus on our goals. And so I think that lesson always sat with me and affected me to a great deal. But I can imagine that in other communities or in other families where that message isn't so strongly asserted, somebody could very quickly fall to the allure of problem gambling.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today, Quinn Trong, Outreach and Evaluation Manager of the North Central Regional Mental Health Board, and Vanessa Della Torre, reporter for WNPR Connecticut Public Radio and part of a public radio collaboration called Sharing America. Coming up, we're going to hear how a local nonprofit is reaching out to the Asian community. We're going to learn more about why there's a reluctance among some to seek help for addiction. And we want to hear from you. Join our conversation, 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Addiction comes in many forms and develops among people from many different backgrounds. Today we're focusing on gambling addiction and how a person's culture can exacerbate this problem, even impacting an individual's ability to reach out for help. You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. In studio with me is Vanessa Della Torre, reporter for WNPR Connecticut Public Radio, also part of a public radio collaboration called Sharing America, and Quinn Trong, Outreach and Evaluation Manager of the North Central Regional Mental Health Board. We've been learning about this series from Sharing America called Fixed Odds, looking at problem gambling among communities of color. Vanessa, you were telling us about your story focusing on Southeast Asian refugees and issues with problem gambling. What did you find out in terms of the trends when you look at whether or not they're seeking help, mental health supports and services?
Right. Well, in the course of reporting, realized, time and again that there's a huge cultural stigma in Asian cultures over seeking help for mental health services and addiction issues. And, in the course of that reporting, came across national data showing that Asians are least likely among ethnic groups in the U.S. to use mental health services. And that's just across the board. And in particular in Connecticut, when you look at problem gambling services, which is part under the state's Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services department. Very few callers who are calling into the problem gambling hotline are Asian. So, for example, there's in Connecticut about 5% of the population is Asian. As far as callers to the problem gambling hotline, it's around 3%.
Quinn, could you build on why there is that stigma? When we say stigma, what do we mean? So if someone is in this particular Southeast Asian community and there's a question of, do I talk to my doctor? Do I go to a local clinic? What's keeping them from doing that?
Sure. I mean, first, there's a self-awareness factor, right? And so if you've grown up in a culture where where gambling and playing cards and going out and going to the casinos is common stance, then you don't think that those activities are problematic in any sort of way. And then, you have to kind of figure out, okay, so at which point is my behavior problematic? And it's really difficult for people who are in the throes of gambling addiction to understand and to recognize when gambling is becoming an impediment to their life, especially when their family and friends are engaged in this activity all the time or with some sort of frequency that most other communities aren't. So I think that self-awareness is a big impediment to accessing help or even a cry for help, which is why I think it's important to talk about gambling and to really figure out when is it safe in recreational gambling and where do you teeter on the line, between safe and problem gambling. But the second part of it is really, this shame, this guilt of, putting something terrible upon your community and your family, making a bad name for yourself, and not living up to your potential. All of us as refugees come over with this huge dream of making it big in some way, and gambling is a means to that end. And when you win, you can talk about it. When you don't win, it's a setback, and it's terrible, and people don't want to talk about it. There's this vicious cycle of depression and anxiety that accompanies problem gambling. And so in our community, we don't have the language to talk about mental health and addiction issues. We don't know how to reach out for help with those particular issues because in our community, it's about survival. It's about just trying to get through the day to day, trying to make your rent, trying to put food on the table for your family. And so when you think about mental health issues, maybe our community thinks it's for other communities that have the resources or have the language or have the culture to be able to access those things, have the resources to access those things. So I think there's an accessibility issue that is also problematic.
Is there an element of skepticism too that, what will this Western clinic treatment methods really do?
Absolutely, yes. I think there's feeling like the outsider and not knowing whether or not, with the language barriers and with the cultural barriers, whether or not there's going to be a resonance with the cultural issues and particular working class issues that people are dealing with. And then, yes, there's a skepticism of, what are these Western methods really there for? And so there needs to be a brokering or a bridging of understanding between service providers that want to make sure that they can connect with the most vulnerable communities and those community members that are, not even aware that they might benefit from these services.
There's a clinic in Hartford that is working to reach out to Asian members in our community. For more, joining us in studio now is Toyan Long, lead case manager with Asian Family Services Program of the Community Renewal Team in Hartford, Connecticut. And it's a community action agency for both Hartford and Middlesex counties, CRT. Toyan, welcome to our show.
Thank you. Good morning.
So tell us a little bit about what is the Asian Family Services Program?
Asian Family Services Program is the agency to provide counseling and support services to individual, family, and group therapy to help clients learn new skills to cope with the variety of life issues such as parent-child conflict, trauma, drug addiction, and losses.
Has this program been around for some time, and why the focus on Asian Americans and refugees?
Yes, this program, it's a program of CRT and the Asian Family Services. It's been in Hartford for quite a while, and they had been helping all this Southeast Asian from war-torn country. And but I joined the program in 2005, so thank you.
And tell us more about the clients that you're seeing. What brings them inside to the door for help?
Some of the clients, they probably have the mental health issue, before, so they came to us to get the treatment for many years. But then other clientele, they came to us through the referral resource, like the court mandate, and also the other clinic for help with their mental health issue when they go to the clinic and they found out that they don't have any physical problem.
I understand you also have a personal experience that helps you in your work with these individuals. You came to the U.S. as a refugee from Cambodia?
Yes, I came here in the state in 2003 as a refugee. I lived in New York for about 20 years, and then I moved up to Connecticut and joined Asian Family Services. I learned that Southeast Asian really need mental health services because of their background of war trauma from, where they come from. And there's a lot of baggage that they carry with them. So also because the population, Southeast Asian, don't know anything about the mental health services. So Asian Family Services established in 1996 to serve those population.
We heard Quinn talk earlier about some of the barriers that keeps Asian members of our community from asking for help. We heard her talk about that feeling of shame. If there is a problem, they don't want to bring shame on their family. Is that something that you hear from your clients?
To the family member themselves and also to the community, losing face is really a big issue because they don't want to bring shame or losing face to the family member or to the community, because that's really the only place and the only connection they have instead of going out there and to socialize with other group. So no, they even though they have mental health issue, they're not going to come forward and seek services so it can help them. Or other group may think that they don't have any issue with the mental health issue or even including the problem gambling.
Toyan Long, again, is lead case manager with Asian Family Services. It's a program for the Community Renewal Team in Hartford. I wanted to go back to Vanessa Della Torre, who reported this story for WNPR and the Sharing America Public Radio collaboration. Tell us more about, we heard Toyan mention that some of the clients are court-mandated to come to get help. Others are getting referrals, maybe from their primary care physician who sees that there's something going on that's exacerbating some health condition, and they find out that there is an addiction to gambling. Is it at the point where people have reached a breaking point, their life is falling apart, they're losing their homes, there's stress in the family that brings them to the door?
Absolutely. That's something that I heard frequently throughout the reporting, is that often, in some cultures it's kind of accepted and common to go seek a therapist when you're maybe going through some depression issues, but in the Asian cultures and in the Southeast Asian community, often, you end up perhaps at Asian Family Services after it's become a crisis. It's already become a crisis. Say you have chest pain because of the enormous amount of stress you're under because of this gambling addiction. Then you end up, say, in the ER. But what's the real underlying issue? It could be gambling addiction. So that's how you might end up seeking services, but it's often not through some voluntary, like I'm just going to go to the clinic, I'm going to go talk to a therapist to work out these issues.
Quinn, I'm curious, when we talk about stigma, we know that in this country there is stigma for many Americans when they think about, do I have a mental health issue and can I ask for help? There is that negative connotation when you go ask for help. Well, people will say, well, I'm not, quote unquote, crazy. Is that something that there's a sentiment there?
Yeah, certainly people are afraid of coming off as, or associating themselves with being crazy because there's this element of uncontrollability to it. And I mean, going back to the luck factor, if you have a bad problem gambling issue, maybe the community will see you as having bad luck because you have bad karma, because the gods are looking down negatively at you, and that's another reason why people don't want to admit to it, because talking about it, putting it out there as reality might really cinch it as reality, and then people are afraid that their luck won't turn, that maybe it's just a string of bad luck and then one day it'll just shift for the better.
This is where we live. Again, we're looking at problem gambling among communities of color, specifically today looking at how problem gambling impacts Southeast Asians and where to go for help. In studio with me is Quinn Trong, who is lead outreach and evaluation manager of the North Central Regional Mental Health Board. Also Vanessa Della Torre, reporter for WNPR, and Toyan Long, lead case manager with Asian Family Services, a program of Community Renewal Team in Hartford. Toyan, I wanted to ask you, when people come in for help, how exactly are they helped? Is it seeing a counselor? Can you talk a little bit about some of the program, like the specifics of the program that help them get past this addiction?
At the moment, you're talking about the counselor for problem gambling. We are trying to pull the resource to offer the services. But if you're talking about the mental health piece, when the client coming in, they resist in the beginning, and it's going to take them a while until they build the trust between the counselor who is going to provide the services in mental health services. And that's it's going to take them a while until they trust, and then they will share or disclose the problem they have, the depression, the addiction, later on until, the trust had built. Otherwise, they probably will just see you with another, person that provide me the counseling, and they will not disclose it. Yeah.
Quinn, can you add to that? Besides counseling, when someone has a gambling addiction, what is really effective for them?
When somebody has a gambling addiction, I think what's important is that the person has multiple layers of support available. And that's something that we really try to highlight in my Asian Ambassadors program. So I just want to talk briefly about that because I think it's a great initiative that's been trying to shed light on this problem gambling issue, not only among Southeast Asians, but among Asian communities and other communities in general. So the Asian Ambassadors program is one where I got recruited to it by Moi Moi Hin McCormick, who was the Asian American Affairs Commissioner, Executive Director a few years ago. And the point of the program is to go out into communities, into vulnerable communities, into Asian American communities, as well as other communities, to talk about the issues that we face with problem gambling, the vulnerabilities that exist, and how we as a community can come around to support people, how we as individuals can come around and support people, and what kinds of resources could exist. So I think, those kinds of educational initiatives into communities is really helpful at least just going out there and saying that this problem exists and it's not particular to you or to your community. It happens all over the place. And what's important is that we talk about it and we identify it and we figure out how we individually as a community and as a system can help address it.
Vanessa, we know in Connecticut there's plenty of places to gamble. I mentioned at the top of the show, besides the lottery and Keno, at bars and restaurants, we have two major casinos in the southeastern part of the state, another one potentially opening up in East Windsor. There's now talk at the state capitol to legalize sports betting. What really does the state do to help people deal with problem gambling when it's everywhere?
Right. I mean, the state has the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, which oversees the Problem Gambling Services Program. Actually, what Quinn just mentioned, the Asian Ambassadors Initiative, that's part of Problem Gambling Services. It's an initiative with them. It's a partnership. But, they have clinics. They have, the hotline. The casinos also provide some funding toward, awareness issues, prevention. They're often sponsors with the Connecticut Council on Problem Gambling, on conferences and whatnot. But it seems like one of the most promising initiatives is the Asian Ambassadors Program because it is focused on this cultural sensitivity. One of the things that Moi Moi Hin McCormick, who Quinn just mentioned, she told me that, one of the issues is this issue of cultural competency. So, say a refugee decides to go and seek help. And there's a language barrier, first of all. And perhaps the clinician doesn't quite understand the historical context, the context of trauma that they're coming from. And perhaps from that meeting, feeling like this person really didn't understand me. And so that word could spread to other members of the community. So that's why it's important to have an initiative that is very culturally sensitive, in which folks from the community are trying to talk and bring awareness about the warning signs of problem gambling.
Quinn, this program that you're part of, Asian Ambassadors, it's seen as a potential national model?
Well, we're piloting it in Connecticut, and certainly we are happy to share what we've learned. We've collected data over the years about what educational modules work for which communities and community types and what age groups. But certainly we would love to talk more about it and to share more about it with people who are interested.
We know that you work to help connect people with mental health services when they need it. Again, looking at ways to reach communities that are underserved. But personally, when you hear that the state of Connecticut continues to expand gambling in the state, what do you see as problematic about that?
Well, certainly there's a tension between what our state needs in terms of revenue and what our state can absorb in terms of some of these social ills that can come out of trying to establish new casinos. I mean, I think, once again, I come from the perspective that gambling by itself isn't a negative behavior, but there are certain vulnerabilities that certain communities have that we have to be aware of and prepare for. And so when we're talking about investing our resources into building new casinos, I'd love to hear us talk also concurrently about building resources to create culturally competent care and to ensure that healthcare access is available for all communities.
How do we then, talk about this problem with younger generations? We've been focusing on, refugee communities, so it's older adults that have come over that have the trauma, that develop possibly an addiction. But then, how do you then send that message to younger generations, especially when we hear that, sports betting might be coming to Connecticut, and it's pretty easy. It's right on your mobile phone.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about that issue, and in the younger communities, we found that talking to them about financial literacy is something that's appealing to them. And talking about problem gambling in the context of financial literacy is a great way to engage young adults and young people to understand and to learn about the issues with problem gambling.
Tuyen, how do you recommend, and what do your clients say when they talk about lessons learned for younger people?
I think I agree with Quinn, and also the education piece, and also teaching them about the awareness of the problem gambling. That's the generation we're talking about. But with the old generation, like we mentioned earlier, that about the trauma and the background they came from, it's a challenge and difficult. And also, I agree with Quinn in terms of the if you can get funding to the Asian ambassador, again with the culture that they know, and the probably piece that it can help to spread the words out, and also raise the awareness of the problem gambling.
One point that Vanessa made before the show, I wanted to bring it up, the fact that we know that gaming has expanded to Massachusetts. They have a very different tact when it comes to regulating gambling within their state, as something that Connecticut doesn't have, and that's independence of it.
Right. I mean, there's one thing that came up in talking to advocates who are in the field of problem gambling is, why doesn't Connecticut have an independent gaming commission that oversees all aspects of gambling, including the Connecticut Lottery, including casinos, including these expanded forms of gambling, including, perhaps sports betting and online gaming. But, for example, if you had such a commission, you could have folks like Quinn, perhaps, who are in the mental health field, who know about the issues that affect different populations in our state in relation to problem gambling. Right now, you don't really have that. Right now, you have, say, for example, the Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection that oversees parts of the lottery. For example, the Connecticut Lottery. If you go to the Consumer Protection Department's website, you're going to see, graphs on like slot revenues over time. But you don't really have that overseer. And an issue, perhaps, is funding. Do you want another commission to fund? Do you want another panel? But that's something that's been brought up.
And in Connecticut, the players that stand to gain are at the table. Both tribes, the Connecticut Lottery Corporation, you even have MGM and other outside influencers lobbying for expanding gaming.
This is a huge potential pot of money. So there's a lot of people at the table, people at the state capitol. One of my former colleagues at the Hartford Courant, John Lender, just published a piece in yesterday's paper, in the Sunday paper, about all the lobbyists that are just coming to the state capitol over the potential of sports betting. He reported, there are contracts in the ballpark of like $2 million, and that we haven't even really gotten started yet. So, that's huge.
Vanessa De La Torre, again, we appreciate you coming on to talk about your story in this Fixed Odds series from the Public Radio collaboration, Sharing America. Can you briefly tell us some of the other stories of our listeners go to the website that they can hear about communities of color dealing with gambling addiction? Sure.
There's a story on Native American gambling addiction. There's a story on military veteran addiction over problem gambling. And one of my other colleagues, Erica Morrison, out of OPB in Portland, Oregon, she focused on Latino laborers who are susceptible to problem gambling. And one of the reasons is that, this desire for the American dream. And like I spoke about earlier, if you're in poverty, gambling could be seen as a way of making money.
Vanessa De La Torre, always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks again.
Thanks, Lucy.
Also, Quinn Trong, Outreach and Evaluation Manager of the North Central Regional Mental Health Board. Quinn, thank you.
Thanks, Lucy.
And Toyin Long, Lead Case Manager with Asian Family Services of the Community Renewal Team in Hartford, Connecticut. And if you're looking for help for someone that you know, even yourself, maybe dealing with gambling addiction, we're going to tweet out a link to the state site of phone numbers and other resources to help you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, 1 in 5 children in America are obese. Besides health consequences, there's a correlation between obesity and bullying. After the break, we're going to learn more, and you can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Children who are overweight or obese are often the targets of bullying. A recent study published in Pediatric Obesity by UConn has found LGBTQ adolescents face a higher rate of weight-based bullying than their heterosexual peers. For more, the lead author of the study joins me by phone, Dr. Rebecca Puhl, Deputy Director of the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity, also professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies at UConn. Dr. Puhl, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me.
So it's interesting when we think about weight-based bullying, but you looked in your fellow researchers focused in on LGBTQ youth. Tell us about what you found out.
Well, we know from almost a decade of research already that weight-based teasing and bullying are very common experiences for adolescents and children. But this research has focused almost exclusively on heterosexual youth, and we know almost nothing about these experiences of weight victimization in sexual and gender minority adolescents. And that omission is concerning because we know that rates of obesity are approximately 20% in adolescents, and that includes sexual minority youth who have high rates as well, and also high rates of maladaptive and disordered eating. And so we really wanted to do a large-scale study to try to understand what these experiences look like. And we conducted a nationwide survey of over 17,000 sexual and gender minority adolescents. This was a comprehensive survey study led by my colleague Ryan Watson at the University of Connecticut. And we conducted this study in partnership with the Human Rights Campaign to really try to understand experiences of victimization and health and family relationships of LGBTQ adolescents across the country.
So when you look at your research, when you focus in on LGBTQ youth, how likely are they to be overweight and underweight? And what are some of the reasons behind that?
We see high rates of overweight and obesity in all youth, and that does include sexual minority youth as well. When it comes to our survey findings, we found two key things that really stood out to us. The first is that weight-based teasing and victimization is very common across diverse sexual and gender identities in LGBTQ kids. And the second is that we're observing this across diverse body weight categories. And what I mean by that is we're seeing high percentages of sexual minority adolescents reporting that they're being teased or bullied about their weight, not only at high body weights like overweight and obesity, but also at low body weights like underweight. And that's not a pattern that we typically see with heterosexual youth.
Oh, you've been a researcher in this field for some time, again, looking at childhood obesity. When we think about whether children are overweight or underweight, what are some of the underlying reasons behind that? Mental health disorders being one?
Well, in terms of reasons for obesity and why those rates are so high, that's a very complicated question that involves a whole range of factors that involve our society, our genetics, our environment, family, eating practices, and we can't pinpoint one singular factor. But what I think is interesting is as obesity rates have increased, so has bullying and teasing. And it's interesting to see that this is now one of the most, if not the most common reason that youth are reporting they're being teased and bullied at school and sometimes at home as well.
When they are teased and bullied, that then leads to depression and anxiety?
Yeah, you're exactly right. What we see is that when children or adolescents are teased or bullied about their weight, this leads to a range of negative consequences, some for their psychological and emotional health, and that includes higher risk of depression and anxiety, low self-esteem, poor body image, even increased rates of suicidal behaviors. But we also see that it reinforces a number of unhealthy behaviors that paradoxically can actually increase weight gain and obesity. So, for example, when we see youth being teased or bullied about their weight, they often turn to food as a temporary coping mechanism. They turn to binge eating. They avoid physical activity, often because physical activities settings are where they feel stigmatized and teased. And so we really do see a combination of both emotional and physical health consequences emerging from these experiences.
Dr. Puhl, when we think about bullying, we often think about peers in school. But what have you found among LGBTQ youth who are part of this study? When we think about bullying, are they also getting it from their family members, even educators?
Absolutely. One of the interesting findings from this study, which is quite concerning, is that across sexual and gender minority identities in our study, we found that between 44 to 70% of adolescents reported that they were being teased and bullied about their weight from family members. And I think it's important to remember that, we see that sometimes parents are worried about their child's weight, often if the child has a larger body size, and parents are sometimes quick to make comments about their child's weight. But this can really backfire, and negative messages about weight and stereotypes about weight have become so automatic in our society that it's easy to have these biases and not even really be aware of them. But it's important to remember that just because we're parents or educated about these issues doesn't mean that we're immune to weight bias. And it can come out in subtle ways and also more overt ways that are very judgmental and shaming to kids and adolescents. So the fact that we are seeing high rates of weight-based teasing, not just from peers in the school setting, but at home as well from family members, indicates that we really do need increased awareness about this issue and that we need to better support these youth.
We just have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to go through some of your recommendations. One finding is that body weight's often absent in school-based anti-bullying policies. You believe that needs to change?
It absolutely does. Most schools now are required to have anti-bullying policies in place, but these policies vary considerably from one school district to another. What we know is that policies that are more comprehensive have better student safety and lower rates of bullying. But it's interesting that despite how common weight-based teasing and bullying has become in children, that this issue is often absent in the language of policies. And we've done a number of national studies to look at support for strengthening these policies, and we see considerable parental support and public support for adding body weight to the language of both anti-bullying policies in schools and anti-bullying laws at the state level.
And what recommendations do you have for pediatricians and other doctors, perhaps, whose patients are LGBTQ youth?
Well, it's interesting. Our findings of this study are really timely in light of a recent policy statement that came out from the American Academy of Pediatrics that really encourages and recommends pediatricians to have this issue of weight-based bullying on their radar and to be assessing and screening youth for these issues. What our new findings say from the study is that pediatric providers should be aware that sexual and gender minority youth are vulnerable to weight-based victimization regardless of what their body size is, and that they should be screening these youth for victimization experiences, not just in the context of sexual identity, but also body weight.
And then, Dr. Puhl, I am curious, just overall, is childhood obesity going down in this country?
Not in the way that we need to be seeing it go down. In some groups, we see kids remaining very vulnerable, especially at earlier ages. And, there's a lot of prevention efforts that need to be put in place, but those need to come really broadly from a societal level if we want to see shifts in these rates.
We'll have to leave it there. Dr. Rebecca Puhl, again, a Deputy Director of the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity, also Professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies at UConn. Thanks so much, Dr. Puhl.
Thank you.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by senior producer Lydia Brown. Special thanks also to our technical producer, Kyone Wolf. And don't forget, Where We Live's coming to a coffee shop near you. We're hosting coffee breaks at local cafes around the state to hear from you. What issue or story in your community is not getting the attention it needs? Join me and producers Lydia Brown and Carmen Baskoff Tuesday, February 26th at Washington Street Coffee House in New London. We can't wait to meet you. Check out our Facebook page for more details and stay tuned for tomorrow's show.